Good afternoon, everybody. For those of us who weren't here this morning, I'm Neil Plantinga from the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship, and it's my joy to host Christine Pohl this afternoon. Dr. Pohl is an ethicist who teaches at Asbury Theological Seminary in Kentucky. She is an author of some really terrific books, including one called Friendship at the Margins, and another on hospitality, and still another, the one that we're going to be talking about to some degree today, on living into community, cultivating practices that sustain us. This is a really wonderful book. Dr. Pohl has a number of qualities of great writing that you will recognize at once. It's lively, it's clear thinking, it's beautifully illustrated. What Dr. Pohl does in this book, and from now on it'll be Christine, I think. What Christine does in this book is to examine four practices, or you might call them virtues, four practices that, that build and sustain community. And the four are gratitude, making and keeping promises, telling the truth, and hospitality. In each case, what she does is to sketch the practice or the virtue, give some examples of it, try various definitions of it, settle on one, and then she talks about complications in practicing this virtue, things that get in the way or that make the practicing this virtue or following this practice difficult. And finally, in each case, she goes deeper into the practice, asking how the practice may be cultivated and sustained in our communities. I have the feeling that you are speaking primarily of the church, but not necessarily always, but it's about community. It's a great, great book, and we'll be talking about it this afternoon in connection with the Sermon on the Mount. Christine, if you could tell us about the genesis of this book, the idea for it. Where did it come from?
Well, greetings, everybody. It's good to be with you. And the book has kind of a complicated genesis, I guess. Part of it just comes out of my own history of always wanting to be part of vibrant Christian communities. Really, I think since high school, just yearning for community and being part of some really wonderful communities. Coming of age in the last phase of people being enthusiastic about Christian community, which I think was sort of in the early 70s. And so there was lots of experimenting with that and being really interested in it. And then being part of those communities and then almost always experiencing some fundamental failure, some meltdown in the community, and not necessarily being surprised by that after a while, but being troubled by it. I mean, what was it that was so deeply entrenched in our communities that would also be a lever for difficulty almost always? So that was one piece, that was the experiential piece. I was involved over the years in a lot of communities of hospitality, and I did my doctoral dissertation on that. And when I was trying to bring the dissertation, which was more historical, into the present, I went and visited communities of hospitality. So these were communities that offered hospitality as sort of central to their life together. So they opened their communities to homeless people or refugees or whatever. And I interviewed I think about 60 or 70 of the practitioners, and wanted to learn about how they did it today, how it was different from Abraham and Sarah's time, those kinds of questions. And one of the things that they said over and over again to me was, hospitality is the best and the hardest thing I've ever done. Which is, after a while you kind of get used to that one. But then a number of them said after that, and I couldn't do it outside of being in community. And doing community is even harder than hospitality. And I thought, oh dear, really, what are we going to do then if we want to recover this practice that's so fundamental to Christian life, and you can't do it without community? But the very people who are practicing community are finding it really hard. And so, what is it about today? So there were all these questions about what is it about us that makes sustaining community so difficult. So those were two parts of what fed into it. And then there were, in the last probably decade or two, all of these conversations about community with people like Robert Weber or N.T. Wright or Stan Hauerwas about Christian community being, the community itself being the best apologetic. And again, for anybody who's experienced with community, you also know that that's a little bit problematic if that's the best we can offer, because we always run into trouble. So that was also part of what was floating around in my mind. And then my students who, were interested in the emergent church and new monasticism, some of those other current movements. So there were lots of questions. The other piece of it, this is a very long answer to your first question. The other piece of it was that because of the work I was doing on hospitality, I got pulled into a conversation about practices. Actually, when I wrote Making Room, I wasn't particularly thinking about it as a practice. I was thinking about it as hospitality. And other people helped me think about it as a practice. And got connected with a group of people who were thinking a lot about practices and had an opportunity to work with them. And was actually eventually asked to do a book on promising, and I couldn't get my head around doing a whole book on promising, but I could if I could connect it to community. And then I started thinking about promising, and you can't really think about promising if you don't think about truthfulness. They're just too intertwined. And so that was sort of the genesis of it. So it all kind of came together, and 10 years later it became a book. So let that be an encouragement to anybody who's working on books. They take a long time, or at least they take me a long time.
Could you have written the same or a similar book if you had treated these four as virtues instead of practices?
No. I don't think so. I think what I was interested in, I'm sure I could have, but what I was interested in was community and the relational dynamics that are significant to community. And for me anyway, the virtue tradition has seemed to be a little bit more individualistic and a little bit static. And I wanted to look a little bit more about what people were actually doing as they were trying to be faithful or trying to be truthful. So I really wanted to look at the action, but also the thinking. And it was a little bit easier to kind of configure that in the language of practices. I don't have a lot at stake in calling them practices instead of virtues. I think, though, that I did have a fair amount at stake in not focusing on them as duties, which is another way that all of these have either been listed as virtues or as duties. And for me, the language of duty, I don't have any problem with obligation and obedience, but the language of duty for this culture sounds burdensome and heavy, and it's hard to think about a duty to do hospitality and be enthusiastic about it, or a duty to be grateful, which is sometimes how it's talked about. And it just seems much more like to talk about it, all of them as a way of life, seem to me a little bit more life-giving. So I used heavily the virtue tradition. I used, the various forms of deontology and so on to develop the arguments. But I think for me it's a little bit easier to talk about them in terms of practices.
You don't treat 8 practices, you treat 4. There's, for example, not a chapter on humility or on forgiveness or others that you could have chosen. What was your sort of principle of choice? Why these 4?
Like I said, it started out because somebody actually had asked me to think about promising. And promising connected with truth-telling very fast. I realized pretty quickly from reflecting on my own experience with working on the practice of hospitality that promising and truth-telling just showed up over and over again with people worried about deception or people who weren't faithful to their promises in terms of the difficulty it made for other people doing hospitality, any of those kinds of things. So they seemed naturally connected. The gratitude piece came a little bit later when I realized that communities that don't practice gratitude, where there's a lot of grumbling or complaining or envy, are unbearable. They're absolutely unbearable. They're horrible places. So it seemed like that was actually pretty central, although almost nobody talks about gratitude in terms of community. There's lots of literature right now on the importance of gratitude to individual well-being. But the importance of gratitude to community is fairly unusual, and it seemed all of a sudden that that was pretty crucial. And I wanted to return to hospitality. So that was, they sort of happened organically. We had Lilly funding to do a big project, well, not a big project, it was a group of about 12 pastors and a couple other people in academia and practitioners who were actually leaders of communities, got together and thought about these practices together. One of the things that we discovered was that they cohered, they made sense. But forgiveness and discernment came up over and over again, as also important. And so there was a real question about, sort of infinite expansion of practices. But it seemed to me, and I'm still not absolutely sure of this, it seems like forgiveness and discernment kick in when the other practices aren't working well. And so there was a reason, plus there's quite a lot of literature on some of the other practices. There's a lot written on forgiveness and discernment. These ones, promise-keeping, truthfulness, gratitude, had not really been looked at that much in terms of community.
It's kind of interesting to me, when Lou Smedes wrote Forgive and Forget, a title he hated and was chosen by Harper, not by him. In 1985, he wrote it because he couldn't find anything very good on forgiveness, and since then there's just been a flood. I mean, that's just the way those things go. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus calls his followers the light of the world, and then says to them, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good deeds and give glory to your Father in heaven. You say, one way or another, quite often that a good practice in a community is the best sermon you're going to be able to preach. Say a little bit more about that, how good practices let a community's light shine.
Well, I think in some ways I was taking that from Jesus' words in John 17 that it's the unity that will proclaim the oneness of the community. The unity of the community will be the witness to the truth of the gospel, to the truth that he had actually come. And so thinking about Christian community, Christian unity in that way made me realize just how much was at stake. And so the idea of Christian communities being little lights or whatever, really shining in the world, I think was reinforced to me when I was working on the hospitality material. And in one of the communities that I visited, which was Jubilee Partners in rural Georgia, that welcomes people who are refugees mostly. And they are a community, I tell about this in Making Room, but they're a community of about 30 or 35 people that welcome 30 or 35 refugees every few months. But at least when I visited them, they also welcomed 3,000 people a year who came to see their shared life. It seemed to me that somehow what they were doing was such a picture of the goodness and the beauty of community that people from all around wanted to see it. They were hungry for a vision of what shared life could look like. So I think there's, if you think about communities like L'Arche, which works with people with ministers alongside people with disabilities, it's the same kind of thing. I think probably they have more people passing through just wanting to see the testimony of that kind of love and care lived out. So I think it's as any of these are exemplary in the world, or even just faithfully lived out in the world, people do catch a glimpse of what it could be in terms of different kinds of relationships.
And then, as you suggested just a minute ago, the opposite, alas, is true too, that when Christian communities are a mess, they become the worst sermon.
Yeah. I mean, nobody's going to get it perfectly, right?
Yeah.
It's not, but when we deliberately betray each other, or when we allow sort of ongoing deception, or when we preach that God welcomes everybody, but we don't make room, it's very difficult. People notice immediately. There has to be a real congruence between what we're saying about God and the kingdom and how we're living it. So if we're not living it, then it makes a lie of everything that we're saying.
I was so struck a minute ago when you mentioned John 17. That is for Jesus to compare unity in his followers and in the others that would be brought in by evangelism, in other words, the church, to intra-Trinitarian unity. That's a very big deal.
It is. It is. And it becomes, I think it's not, in a sense, it's not something that we can kind of generate. It's really finally by grace. It's a gift. And yet it's crucial. I mean, people are not going to understand, I think, who God is if they don't see some semblance of that community lived out among us.
I'm reminded that the Greek fathers and mothers, when they were drafting their version of the doctrine of the Trinity, taught that the three persons in God have perichoresis, which means that each person harbors the other two at the center of his being. So it's a form of divine hospitality. That's a sort of a lovely tie-in.
Yeah, yeah. I have come to much more fully appreciate the Trinitarian aspects of hospitality since I wrote Making Room, and encountered all sorts of people who have thought about it more than I had, and I just love it. I think it's great. Yeah.
One of the places that struck me is when you are talking about hospitality, both in this book and in Making Room, you mentioned that some forms of it become a little bit grudging. You making room for somebody, making somebody feel at home when you wish they were.
I like that one.
What's the help for that?
Sabbath, maybe. Yeah, I think that's part of what was fun and important about working on the four practices together, was seeing where they intersected and where they helped each other. And realizing, especially as these pastors would be trying to talk about one of these practices, how often what they were also talking about was two or three others. And in something like grudging hospitality, which you read about in 1 Peter, and it's let your hospitality be ungrudging. And it's like, well, why would they do it begrudging? Well, anybody who's done a fair amount of hospitality knows there are lots of reasons why you can be grudging about it. But if it doesn't come out of a heart of gratitude, it's likely to become grudging because it's hard, and guests are not, especially if you're working with more sort of marginalized populations, guests aren't always grateful. They don't always say thank you. They don't always sort of understand the proper role of the guest. And I think if it doesn't spring from something beyond that interaction, if it's not a response to the grace we've experienced in our lives, it's very hard to sustain. And grudging hospitality is a terrible thing. It humiliates the guests, and it just weakens and wearies the hosts. And so recognizing sometimes that grudging hospitality can be because the rest of the community has not been very faithful in helping out. You know, they haven't kept their commitments and so on. So there's lots of different ways that the practices kind of intersect on it.
In the chapter on truth-telling, you speak for a bit about self-deception. And it occurs to me that self-deception is very hard to spot. I mean, the very thing that you're trying to spot is what keeps you from spotting it. Are there any tells, any signs that we can fasten on, do you think, to suspect ourselves?
Yeah. Self-deception is sort of the bane of people who want to be good, right? You really, if you need to hide from yourself the problematic aspects. And so I think that's a situation in which you really do need a faithful community and to begin to practice the truthfulness within accountability and within faithfulness that will allow sometimes someone else to do it. I think oftentimes the problems that I encountered with communities are often with leaders that don't own their own sinfulness, right? That in some way somehow stop thinking about it or kind of, you know, put it in little packages and kind of put it to the side so that they don't deal with it. And so I think you do need a community to help you with that. I think part of the other difficulty is that we really do have a tendency to be so unwilling to name our own sin because we're afraid of it, that we live in constant fear that other people will recognize it and so on. So there's not enough grace to go around either, and sometimes not enough grace even with ourselves that allows us to face it and then confess and repent and move toward healing.
Well, I mean, think of all the difficulties in confronting somebody who you think is self-deceived. Rebuke is basically a lost art. The church, New Testament church, appears to have practiced it, but we're really afraid of being thought judgmental.
I think that's where some of the practices and their difficulties intersect with some particularly difficult cultural dynamics, one of which is, you know, sort of a consumerist mentality. If you don't like it, you just move on for the next better deal. It's actually extremely hard to do any kind of accountability or rebuke if people don't stay. It's hard to do it if people aren't faithful enough to care for you after you've named the wrong. But the other side of that is people who don't want to hear about their lives just move on to the next community where they can continue doing what they want, or the next congregation. And so I think that's, yeah, rebuke is difficult. Rebuke is difficult also because sometimes it's very, it's a notion of truth-telling that tends to be very narrowed. So it's only, our truth-telling can be, there's a lot of things we can tell the truth about. In the framework of rebuke, it tends to be a very narrowed piece. And that can be important when there's a problem. But that's almost become our understanding of telling the truth, is just telling what nobody wants to hear and deal with and so on. And yet speaking the truth can be about really good things as well.
Yeah. I've been impressed over the years when on the receiving end of rebuke, that a lot, to me, depended on the tone of voice and the body language of the rebuker. Whether it's, you know, territorial and confrontational, or whether it's imploring.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, you know, Jesus' words there about, you know, not imagining that you can take the speck out of your brother's eye when you've got the log in your own, I think really speaks to this. We can help one another, but it has to be in the context of humility and a recognition of our own frailty and sinfulness. Then I think it can be heard much more readily. Not always, I mean, but oftentimes much more readily. Also, I think if someone knows that you're going to be faithful to them, that you love them, it's going to be easier to hear it. Maybe not immediately, but over the long term.
There's a wonderful place in Jonathan Edwards' treatise on religious affections in which he's talking about hypocrisy and says in effect that your beginning hypocrite may know that he's false, and your recovering hypocrite may know that he's false, but your deep dish hypocrite thinks he's sound.
Did he say it like that?
Well, I did the deep dish part myself.
That's great.
But I mean, I've always speculated that one reason Jesus in Matthew 23 goes after the teachers of the law so hard is that he's trying to dent their self-deception.
Yeah, yeah. And the hypocrisy is so intertwined with self-deception. I think that religious people are prone to hypocrisy because we want to be good and we want to at least look like we're good, which I think you say in your book. And so if we can't get that coherence across our life, then we'll pretend. And I think that's the challenge. We can't live with ourselves as less than whole. But I think there are lots of times where people's critique of us as hypocrites has a certain validity to it, because as we live our lives in different segments or different spheres, it's possible to really conduct ourselves differently in different spheres. And I think oftentimes that's what the world is kind of saying about Christians is, oh, he's this nice person in church and he's ruthless in business. Yeah. Or, you know, the church says that we should be doing this or worries about these sins, but look what it does. You know, it doesn't even speak the truth to each other in the congregation. So.
Yeah. And the various abuse scandals within the church, both Catholic and Protestant, show in some cases how self-protective people can be within the church. They will protect each other rather than have the truth come out.
I think that sometimes we don't want to shame God.
Oh.
And, you know, I think we're protective, not just of each other, but of our testimony and of God. And we don't want the world to see just how badly we've blown it. And we don't want God to, in a sense, be embarrassed, as if God could be. But I think we do worry about that. And so I think there are times when that move is a move of protection that really is actually partly caring about the message of the gospel. I mean, it's wrong-headed, but it's an attempt to sort of preserve something that really needs to be preserved in a different way.
That's interesting. So it's got something to do with God's reputation.
I think don't you think so?
Yeah, could be.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think ultimately, well, I mean, it does have something to do with God's reputation. Unfortunately, hypocrisy makes it worse rather than better, but yeah.
Let's go back to a question that Dr. Bailey and I were talking about this morning. I'd be interested in your take on righteousness in the Sermon on the Mount, whether the English word righteousness captures dikaiosune as well as the word justice.
Well, I am not going to weigh in as a New Testament scholar because that's not what I am. But I don't think, I can speak as an ethicist though, and I don't think that righteousness is language that people today get. I think most of the time when somebody uses the language of righteousness, they're thinking self-righteousness, right? It doesn't have the freight of all that it means in the scriptures, of sort of a whole life, the goodness that's there. I think...
Or it's slang for cool, as in, he's a righteous dude.
Oh, really? Okay, I missed that one. Is it really?
Yeah.
Okay, I missed that one. Yeah, all right.
Yeah, righteous began to have the overtone. I first noticed it beginning to have the overtones of self-righteous in the 1970s, when Time magazine did a piece on Spiro Agnew, the vice president, and accused him of being righteous.
And that was an accusation of self-righteousness, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think, I mean, if we could recover the richness of the meaning of righteousness, that would be fine. I think it seems to me that in the Sermon on the Mount, that the Dikaiosune actually has both, as Dr. Bailey was saying this morning, has both meanings. And because when you think about the prophets or whatever being persecuted, in some ways it was partly because of righteous lives, and they're calling people to individual righteousness, and it was because of their stand on justice. I mean, both of them were happening. So I think even in the Sermon on the Mount, we've got both things going on. And I think we don't want to lose either one of them. In our work for justice, we have to hold on to righteousness. In our commitment to individual holiness, purity, goodness, an element of that, a crucial element, is caring about social circumstances and so on.
But I was just thinking that during the civil rights struggle or the campaign against apartheid in South Africa, if you said, blessed are you when you are persecuted for justice' sake, it has quite a different feel. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's right.
Back to truth-telling for a moment. Do you know of, or can you say a little bit about how when a community lets its light shine through truth-telling, how they got there or what effect it has? I mean, can you think of any respects in which, let's say, the world or unbelievers are especially struck by Christians' truth-telling?
I think in terms of the practice, maybe of truthful living, which I think is a little bit bigger than truth-telling.
Okay.
I've been struck, and I tell about this a little bit in the book. There's a community, a friend of mine leads a community that ministers alongside people who are homeless. And they have a staff of about 25, and one of their commitments in what is essentially a fairly difficult situation is to truthfulness with the guests, but it's also particularly truthful living among the staff. And Keith was part of the project that generated the book. But one of the things that they practice is what they call clear, and they don't start their weekly staff business meeting without making sure that all of the relationships among the staff are okay. And if they're not okay, either they stop the meeting or they will recommend that people take care of that at a different time and then set a time for it. That has been really crucial to their ability to do this for 30 years. It's been a way that you don't, I mean, some of you know what level of burnout happens in some of these ministries. They don't have that. They don't struggle with that as much because they've got something in place in which, in a sense, they take care of each other. It's a biblical practice in the sense that you don't go into worship or whatever if there's something you know your brother or sister has against you and so on. So they are very attentive to that. So that's one place where I've actually seen it really as a central practice in the community. That's a good one.
That's a good one. Thank you. Let's talk about gratitude for a bit. Later in this symposium, I'm going to do a powwow on the Heidelberg Catechism, and its whole third section is titled Dankbarkeit, gratitude, thankfulness. And it appears to treat gratitude principally as the motive of good Christian living. You say something about gratitude as a motive.
I think our lives are lived in response to God's grace. And as Bart said, if our lives are lived in response to God's grace, then the only reaction that's appropriate is gratitude. And so I think that's really one of the reasons that I start the book with gratitude. I actually, in the process of the meetings, gratitude was the last one we did. But when I went to write the book, I thought, no, you have to start with gratitude. Gratitude has to frame how we live and how we think about any of the things we do. It's response to the grace we've received. Because otherwise, any of these practices, any of these efforts at building community are just about, ultimately, our efforts, our work, which can, in the end, become a form of idolatry in itself. So when we reflect on how much we've received from God's goodness, that we belong to Him, any of those things, that just, I think, significantly changes sort of how we stand, how we face difficulties, how we live faithfully.
I'm often struck in reading the letters of Paul that he can be up to his neck in trouble and yet pour out thanksgiving to God for the people he's writing to.
That's right.
And that he in turn enjoins them, sing with thanksgiving, give thanks to God. It seemed that Paul regarded it as one of the great, great evidences of being in union with Christ, that you overflow with gratitude.
I think that's right. It's one of the practices that is utterly life-giving. Mm-hmm. Even in the most difficult circumstances. And I think mostly we think that that the people who are grateful are the people who have things going well for them. But that's not true at all. I mean, oftentimes the people who express the most extraordinary gratitude are the people in really hard circumstances. But they know, that God got them up this morning and gave them another day and so on. So
God got them up in their right mind.
In their right mind, yes. Yes, I love that.
Yeah. One of the things that I was wondering about with respect to gratitude is that you say several times in the book that people who can rejoice in a small occasion or a simple thing have a light trigger for gratitude, but they have to notice some goodness about that small occasion or simple thing. So you talk a good deal about being attentive. Mm-hmm. Say a little bit about that.
One of the things that when we were working on the project that we learned early was that if we weren't attentive to the good practices, I mean, I actually sent people back before the next meeting to sort of come up with an incident first on promise keeping. And almost everybody came back with a story about betrayal. And when we went to do truth-telling, it was mostly about deception. And I think that's because we mostly don't notice when things are going well. When people are practicing truthfulness, truthful living, well, yeah. I mean, that's what's supposed to happen. Or when they keep their promises. On the little things, we don't even notice that. That just kind of holds up the structure. Similarly with gratitude, I think you notice when it's failing. You notice envy, you notice grumbling and complaint and so on. But we don't even cultivate a setting in which we're going to think about being grateful. So helping people to be attentive to the beauty and the goodness in life, to actually, one of the guys said, people, oh no, I forgot the saying, but people will essentially repeat what's celebrated, what's recognized. If you acknowledge it, then they'll do it. And I have found in my own life that when I'm a little bit more intentional about noticing the good, it overflows me even in the difficult times. So partly it's a discipline. Mm-hmm. It's a discipline of seeing and remembering, because gratitude also is, of course, connected to remembering all that we've received.
The church fathers and mothers who talked about the 7 deadly sins included gluttony among them, and part of what the church fathers were after in the discipline of fasting was to become far more attentive to the good. First in food, but then because our appetites are linked, also in God and in others. I thought that was a powerful insight, so that you become the kind of person who is deeply grateful at the end of a workday for an apple and a book. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that connects with sort of a fundamental cultural problem we have with entitlement, where at this point, so many of us sort of assume that we deserve good things, we deserve a lot of good things, we almost deserve to have things go well for us, and so on. So as Paul Tournier said, you know, if you're entitled to everything, you're grateful essentially for nothing. There's no way to be grateful for a gift if somehow you were entitled to it. And so again, sort of doing the kinds of disciplines that'll shift our thinking about that is really crucial.
One of my friends at his father's funeral testified that his father was a joyful man in large part because he expected so little. And that when he got even a meal, an ordinary meal, he looked at it as if he had no right to it at all. And here it was, and it was for him, and it would be nourishing and delightful. So my friend said, you know, his father, because he was so grateful, had turning within him a powerful engine of joy, all coming from gratitude.
Yeah, that's nice.
Yeah.
That's good.
But gratitude can be aborted, as you were suggesting, by, let's take envy. Envy, the resentment at somebody else's good. It's interesting to me that envy can be for something that wouldn't do you any good at all. I mean, you're 18 and your sister is 16 and your parents give your sister a more generous curfew than they gave you when you were 16, and you resent it, even though it's not going to do you a bit of good.
Right.
It's hard to work up a lot of gratitude for your own privileges when you resent the slightly better ones of somebody else. That's very hard.
It is hard. It is hard. And I think, actually, I learned a lot about what I know about envy from you. I want to acknowledge that from his very fine book on sin. I'm an expert on community. He's an expert on sin. Right?
Hold on here. Hold on. It's just because I read a lot.
But one of the things as I was working on community, one of the things that came out over and over again was the danger of envy to community. I mean, Kierkegaard calls envy a small town sin because we don't compare ourselves to famous people, we compare ourselves to each other. And so that's most likely to happen in a congregation or a family or a small community or whatever. And because envy is so terrible, I mean, so not wanting someone to wanting what they have and not wanting them to have it is such a kind of despicable thing that it, I think, results in hypocrisy and deception very quickly. And so as a sin, as a difficulty, it has the capacity to kind of unwind relationships very, very quickly.
It's also probably the nastiest of the seven deadly sins. The other sins all have, in their twisted ways, some pleasure, but envy is sheer poison.
And very hard to address because you end up kind of getting pulled into its sort of whirlpool. Yeah.
Grumbling. You say a bit about grumbling in connection with things that make gratitude difficult. And you quote The Great Divorce at one point, where there's a woman whose grumbling is so habitual that she is gradually thinning down until she's finally nothing but a grumble.
Yeah, I just think that's one of the most memorable passages. It's a terrible thought, right? Where the only thing that's left of you is your complaint and your grumble. That's a pretty sad image. I was struck as I worked on grumbling by a passage in the Rule of Benedict, where there's this is a rule that has guided Benedictine life for centuries. There's a lot about grumbling and a lot of warning against grumbling, but it's the strangest thing. Right in the middle of it, there's this discussion, there's a word to the leaders about not causing justifiable grumbling, which actually suggests that there is a way. Well, obviously, there are ways in which we can structure life, congregational life, family life, whatever, that will result in grumbling, but sometimes it results in grumbling because the choices that have been made have actually been bad things. And so leaders can sometimes misuse the warning against grumbling in a way to sort of cut off justifiable criticism. And I thought that was such an insightful thing to have in the middle of this fairly brief rule.
In South Africa, during the apartheid regime, criticism of the government was illegal. Mm-hmm. So first they would be unjust, then they would outlaw criticism, then if there was criticism, they'd punish it brutally.
Yeah. So there's, because that would be perceived, the way you could make that work is by saying that that was unjustified and those kind of things.
I one time went to church on Thanksgiving and heard a sermon in which there was the requisite thanksgiving to God, but in connection with our big Thanksgiving dinners, the sermon made me feel guilty for having a big Thanksgiving dinner because, after all, there were all the people in the world that didn't have one. And I've been ambivalent about it ever since. I mean, I think it was a good idea for me to bring those people to mind, but it was Thanksgiving Day, and it was harder to give thanks for the meal that I sat down to. What do you think about giving thanks for gifts that we know are withheld from others?
Nice. Thanks, Neil. I think that there is a crucial place for celebration in the Christian life of the abundance and wonder and overflowing grace that is represented in something like a Thanksgiving meal. And I think that we're a little bit afraid of celebration and gratitude, that somehow celebration and gratitude mean we don't care about hungry people. And I think sometimes that's true, but I don't think that's always true. And I think, as some of the people that I learned from, there are ways in which the only way that you can keep going in the most difficult circumstances is through celebration and gratitude and remembering all the good that God has done. So we want to be careful. I mean, we want to be tender and wise and steward the resources that we have well, but I think there's a place for celebration. I think there's also a place for thinking very much about how we live our lives and the resources and the way that we use our resources and so on that can represent much better stewardship, much better sharing. There are ways in which our abundance could be used so differently to benefit people. But I don't think that would necessarily, that celebration itself is problematic. I think that they have to be held together, but not, you don't choose one or the other.
You say in your book that some people give us difficult gifts that make our gratitude a little bit ambivalent. Talk about that a little. I found that fascinating.
The gifts are the people.
Well, they give you a gift that has some significant strings attached, or a gift that they mean you to use in a way that you know you can't use.
Yeah, gratitude, as I worked on it and thought about it, ended up being a fairly complicated practice because there are gifts that are problematic. I think I start out one of the chapters telling about I was teaching an intensive a couple of years ago, and two of the guys were just visiting the seminary for the week, and in the middle of the intensive, they said they wanted to take me out for a really nice dinner. And I mean, I know that all they meant to do was take me out for a really nice dinner, but I couldn't accept that gift in the middle. I hadn't given any grades yet. I mean, there were ways in which there are certain gifts that you simply can't use because one way or another that they're inappropriate. There are other gifts that can kind of sidetrack a community, as when you get designated money for something that you can't necessarily do. Every gift, one of the things I learned was that every gift has strings. It's not that when we say that gifts don't have strings, it's because we don't want to think about them as exchanges. But they're still attached to what the donor intended or what the donor wanted, so that we have to recognize that in how we use it. I mean, part of the question then is the use of the gift. And so there are all sorts of complicating factors. The other part is that sometimes the gift is good, but the giver, I mean, the givers don't necessarily come perfect either. And so figuring out your relationship to them and so on can be complicated. And something very simple in congregational life is when somebody makes a contribution to the community. One of the things that actually came up several times was like when someone mows the lawn of the church, and then on a rainy day, 3 or 4 people drive over it. People may have said thank you for doing it, but they dishonored the gift by not caring about the work that was invested. And in working with volunteers, how often those kind of issues can come up when the community doesn't recognize the gift that's been given, or they think a thank you is enough when really honoring the gift in some way is important.
What rhythms or rituals of gratitude could be established in a community, maybe in a church, that would enable us all to be a more grateful culture?
I think some of the pastors taught me about this. After we had talked about it, some of them went back and actually, at their next annual meeting, church meeting, set aside like a chunk of time for simply expressing gratitude in all sorts of ways. So just making that central to the meeting. In other communities, they simply don't start dealing with the business until there's some time of expressing gratitude. What other ones?
Those are really ways of counting your blessings one by one, which you can do as a person at the end of a day too.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So starting the day with gratitude, waking up. I'll quote it tomorrow, but there's a wonderful thing from William Law of waking up every morning as if the day were created just on your behalf, as a mini resurrection. I mean, it's just an amazing kind of picture. And then ending the day also recounting the moments of grace. Thinking about the way in which a person has been God's grace to you in that day. Those kind of things.
You quote Lewis Smedes, who, by the way, taught at Calvin College for many years. I know he did because I had him as a prop. That promise making and keeping are the tough fibers that hold together a good community. Mm-hmm. Say a little about promise making and keeping within a community and why it's so good.
Yeah, you can't really have a community if people don't make commitments to one another, and then if they don't keep them. So again, it's the kind of thing that another writer said, promise keeping and truth telling are sort of like the supports of a house. You don't really notice the rafters unless the roof falls in, then you notice. But basically, you can't have a community if people don't make commitments and don't keep them. So the issues, of fidelity, of promising, of commitments are just fundamental to how we live together, whether it's a marriage or it's a family or it's a congregation or any kind of intentional community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the things that always occurs to me is that today, so many people want to keep all their options open. If you're a college student, you go to a party, and instead of enjoying the party, you keep texting your friends to see what parties they're at, and you never dwell fully in the present. You're always trying to look out into more and more options. I imagine that it's hard to make commitments if you are in that frame of mind.
I think that keeping our commitments open with sort of always looking for the best deal kind of governs us at this point. I, for years at Asbury, oversaw the Missions and Mercy and Justice Conference every year. And it was mostly executed by a team of students. So it took 30 or 40 students to pull it off. And in the last probably 5 or 6 years, it has become increasingly difficult to recruit volunteers. It takes about 5 or 6 weeks at the beginning of the year, the beginning of the semester to do it. People volunteer much less for longer term commitments. We can pull in everybody we need the last night, but we cannot get them to commit to the whole time, except for a couple of people. And I think it's sort of like, well, I don't know what's going to come up.
Yeah.
You know, I can't really say yes to that because this might happen. And after a while, all of these uncertainties kind of line up, and you can't make any plans. And so it becomes hard, and it plays out in things like if some of you are youth group leaders or whatever, where you can't get the commitments you need, either from the volunteers or sometimes from the kids or the parents, to actually make a program go. Because we want to just make sure there's too many other options out there, and we value choice.
Even with things like invitations to meals, institutions have difficulty getting RSVPs from people, and they just don't know who's coming or how many.
Right. That's right.
Yeah.
Weddings.
Yeah.
Waiting kind of till the last minute to respond. Yeah.
There are also creative anti-realists, is what my brother Al, the philosopher, calls them. People who think that we actually sort of invent the world that we inhabit. It's not that our minds must conform to the world, but the world to our minds. And so we are constantly reinventing ourselves. We are a new self every day. That's going to make it a little hard to keep promises because the promise was made by some earlier version.
That's right. That's right. That might work in a few of the situations, but
get you off the hook.
That's right. Yeah.
What could a congregation or a community do by way of routines or rituals or practices to encourage promise making and
the
keeping?
Importance, I think, and this is an area for you all more than for me, but it seems to me that in something like baptism, which is a whole constellation of promises, there could be so much more teaching on what those mean. I think we could be more attentive to the promises that we make in ordinary life. I think pastors can model promise keeping in significant ways. I remember when a student of mine wrote on an experience that he had being on the staff of a church where the senior pastor was absolutely incapable of saying no to anyone's request. And so always said yes to whatever they asked, but then would go to the staff and ask them to keep his commitments. That was a good recipe for disaster pretty quickly. But I think that's helping people to actually think about what they've promised. Some people suffer from too much commitment. You know, that there are people who can eventually feel overwhelmed by promise making or promise keeping. But I think oftentimes that has to do with making too many promises without thinking about the fact that some of them are going to conflict or that you're finite and you cannot do all of the things. So a more realistic kind of understanding of promising, I actually think, could help.
I think it's time for us to invite you into the conversation. Does anybody have a comment or a question for Dr. Pohl? Stand up, Greg. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pohl. It's a fascinating discussion. I believe firmly that God created us to live in community. So it was not good for Adam to be alone. And so he found him a helper. And that helper was a relationship of submission. And I've been introduced to the world of attachment disorders through our son. And in our home,
Did everybody hear that okay? Okay. Yeah. Basically, the question is about the role of trust in relationships, and noting that I hadn't said very much about trust. I actually think that trust is a result of the combination of truthfulness and fidelity. And so that you can't have trust in relationships if you don't have promise-making and promise-keeping, and if you don't have truthfulness. Now that will take us into the conversation about transparency, which is also partly about truthfulness. So I think nobody can do anything together without trust for very long. You can work on a fairly thin understanding of trust for a little bit, but really substantive relationships depend on trust, and that has to do with sort of long-term commitment to making and keeping promises and being truthful with one another.
Please stand up.
And shout. Everybody can hear that one? Oh, you can repeat that one.
Well, the question is about whether there has been real slippage in hospitality, primarily within the church from earlier years and within neighborhoods. And then there were some additional issues having to do with truth-telling, but the principal part of the question was about slippage in hospitality.
It's a good question. I think there has been some slippage in hospitality. I think there's been as much slippage in community as kind of the larger context for that. So we used to have block parties. We used to be a neighborhood, those kind of things. Some of that are real changes. I think some of the larger economic trends and trends of who's working have affected hospitality. The notion that we used to have people over after church on Sunday, or we used to have family dinners, doesn't fully account for the fact that almost every woman of working age is now working, or whatever, or many women are working. So it requires that we rethink how we do some of those things, because they can seem overwhelming. If one of the experiences of contemporary life is that everybody thinks they don't have any time. Now, I mean, we still have 24 hours a day, but the days are filled up differently. And so people are on call more of the time. It's harder. People are less willing to organize, to do things together. They might be able to do things alone, but their schedules often are more scattered. So it's harder, I think, to do things together. I think we have to find a way to do that, but I think we need to recognize it. I think that's some of the issue with volunteering in the church also. People are tired, they're busy, and so on. But I think also they haven't recognized just how important their contributions are, that everybody has to do some of it together. So,
you know, those patterns have been now recognized enough that there are residential housing movements and village square movements in city planning where you have to walk if you want to go to the store, and you have to walk past your neighbor's retro front porch.
Right. I think people are not happy with the way things are. It's not very life-giving. I mean, people want the patterns of hospitality and community and so on. But I don't think they've necessarily thought about the choices that they're making that make that more difficult. And so I think congregations can effectively spend some time thinking about what's keeping us from doing the very things that we say we want, and then making choices that are a little bit different.
Right field. Right field. Yes, sir.
Yes, piggybacking off of hospitality, you mentioned earlier about the grudging hospitality, which sounds a bit almost oxymoron, grudging hospitality. But in relation to gratitude, could you elaborate the relationship between the two? Because I don't see presence of one in the absence of the another. Gratitude and hospitality, or like the generosity. Could you elaborate the relationship between the two? How they're distant?
How they're what?
How they're different?
How they're different? I think they're actually very related. This is a question about the connection between hospitality and gratitude. I think that hospitality at its core is, again, a response to the welcome we've received from God. So the most wonderful hospitality is, in a sense, the gratitude that comes out of the welcome we've experienced. And so, as I think Miroslav Volf says, we can't be recipients of God's grace unless we become agents of it. In a sense, we receive God's hospitality, and then we share it. As we do that, it's going to be an expression of gratitude and hospitality. I mean, they're going to be together on that. There are ways in which you can be practicing hospitality and find it difficult, because there are ways in which it's just trying, it's hard. And so it becomes, especially if it's over the long term, or if the guests are difficult, or if you're not getting help or whatever, and there can be a certain grudgingness to it, which can really then sort of undermine the practice.
Straight center field.
Center field.
With the idea of gratitude, promises, truth, and trust, building and shaping community, how does discipleship fit into community? Because I feel as though discipleship is a direct result of a Christ-centered vertical focus within the community, which is established through the gratitude, trust, promises that have already been stated or followed through. But how would you address community, or how would you address discipleship within that community?
It's an interesting question. You can help.
Yeah, go ahead, say more.
The good teacher's response.
I also feel that oftentimes that discipleship is often put on the back burner of community because we're afraid of bringing forth the problems in our own lives and bringing them into the community to be prayed over and to be given solely to God and having someone walk alongside of us. And I think that oftentimes we're begging for a community, but we forget that we're invited by God into a fellowship and community of believers. And so I just didn't know like how you would put discipleship within community.
Well, isn't discipleship a way of getting into the community in the first place? I mean, you are a follower of Jesus, and others are followers of Jesus, and you naturally are followers of Jesus within this body. So discipleship, following Jesus, is sort of the way the community forms. And then within the community, the continuing effort to follow Jesus includes things like gratitude, truth-telling, evangelism, all the signs of being a disciple of Jesus. All those virtues, you know, like in Colossians 3, compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, those are all virtues of Christ. They're also, most of them, fruit of the Spirit. So the virtues or practices, it seems, are sort of the signs or the marks of a community formed by being faithful disciples of Christ, and the continuing exhibit of those virtues or practices shows continuing following of Christ. That's how I would see it.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the question is kind of hard to get my head around because I think this is finally all about discipleship. And so I'm trying to figure out what's at stake here. I think maybe thinking about these as practices just become a lens for thinking about the broader question about how we're going to be faithful disciples and how we're going to help one another be faithful disciples, so that in a community where there's accountability and support, where there's teaching and nurturing and so on, this is one way of getting at some of the relational dynamics which I think sometimes get overlooked. Even discipleship sometimes actually ends up being fairly individualistic. It's about getting my particular individual practices of prayer and Bible study and so on right, and then everything will be okay, and not necessarily looking at what's going on between or among persons. This is just one way of getting at that, I think.
Second row.
So in talking about hospitality and community in general, there's also the issue of boundaries that in some ways define what we mean by community, right? And also what it means to practice hospitality well. So if you could address the relationship between boundaries and hospitality, and feel like extending into that, bring it into the church more, boundaries when we talk about fellowship around the table, the Lord's table, what boundaries are appropriate or not appropriate there in terms of Christian community.
You can have the table one.
When is this due?
You're right. That's right. I think there is, at the heart of hospitality, of Christian hospitality, there is a tension about boundaries. We are called into a covenant relationship with God. That covenant includes being a particular people, a faithful people that is characterized by a certain set of practices and commitments. We are also called within that covenantal relationship to reach out. There is always going to be a difficulty. That's just one of the internal tensions present in the practice. I think it's the thing, in many ways, it's the most difficult question because you have this continual kind of push-pull where you want to welcome people. I don't think hospitality is actually nearly as difficult a question as something like membership. Membership is the bigger, it's like, what does it take to be us? Just how much like us, how much conformity is required to become part of us. With hospitality, if it's hospitality in the sense of a fairly short-term relationship, that's not usually a very big issue. But the boundaries do come, and communities are changed by the people they welcome. And so being attentive to that is a crucial part, and working through those. That's why I think it's never a fully stable, simple kind of dynamic. And I will defer to you about fenced tables or whatever the other, Wesleyans don't do that.
I don't do that either. Third row.
Just a couple of brief observations. When the person asked about discipleship, it made me think of the old expression that has been used politically. It takes a village to raise a child. It takes a community of God, Christ, to make a disciple. And I think that speaks to it. The other thing that I was noticing, interestingly, reflecting on 40 years of ministry, you look at the four practices. As I've sought to instill these in churches, the response has always been the negative. Great. Gratitude. But we didn't say thank you before. Making promises. If you don't keep that, they'll crucify you. Telling the truth. That's what the church. Hospitality, well, we didn't do that for someone else. And so we allow the negative to replace the commission to do the positive. Any reflection?
That maybe confession and repentance would be in order. There are always, none of this is easy, and things can go awry in any number of ways. I think the challenge is to let people get a vision of how life-giving this kind of life can be. That this is, God doesn't institute, in a sense, these practices just to make them duties. This is because this is what it takes. These are the relational dynamics of grace and truth. This is reflecting, in a sense, who Jesus is, and that's what the community is called to be. So yeah, it'll be difficult, but it will also be good. And so helping them to, I have been startled sometimes, I think, because sometimes people are content with a fairly thin version of community and life together and so on. And I think actually, ultimately, that's a theological problem. They need a bigger vision of who God is and what God wants for us as a people.
It seems like they point to the darkness as an excuse.
Yeah.
On the edge.
Yeah, I'm really captured by your comment on truth telling. I look at the four practices, and for me, I think that's the one I see people scared about the most, right? Hospitality, sure, I can have you in my home. Promise keeping, yeah, that's okay. Gratitude, sure, why not be thankful? But truth telling, woo! And so I just wonder, how do we, and I think part of the reason, as I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking aloud about this, two things that I see in the Christian community that are barriers to truth telling, and I'm wondering if you have thoughts on how to break through barriers. One, I think, is this sense of we have to be nice to people, this kind of Christian niceness, because if you tell the truth, you're going to be mean and we shouldn't judge. And the other thing is relationship. I think in order to be able to tell the truth at various levels, you have to have various levels of relationship. So kind of reflecting that back to you, but especially wondering about this Christian idea of niceness. How do we break through that?
So sometimes niceness is nice. I mean, it's just sort of like, it's better than being mean. But I think it can become an excuse for sort of a veneer of almost falsity, where we simply don't, we're not going to address anything that matters because we're worried about hurting somebody's feelings. I think that may actually have to do a lot with fidelity and commitment to one another. That you don't want to be bothered with the difficulty of being truthful because it's simply too much trouble in terms of the relationship, in terms of the time, the commitment that you would have to make to that person to kind of walk with them through it. I think truthfulness becomes easier in communities, easier and more difficult in some ways, in communities that really are close-knit, where people know that you're going to be faithful, that if a problem is revealed, people still love you and will not reject you. I think one of the difficulties in Christian community is that we don't want our faults revealed because we're very unkind to one another. And we do not stand by each other to the point of healing, or the person who finds out about it leaves before there's any chance of doing that. So I think the promise-keeping and the truth-telling are actually very closely connected. And unless there's a culture of trust, it's hard to do very much truth-telling. I think one of the pastors that I worked with said he was persuaded that truth-telling was the hardest of the practices, at least for us. And I think it's for a lot of the reasons that you noted.
Yeah, I think telling the truth is very hard. And it's not just in cases where you have a difficult truth that you have to tell. It actually takes a fair amount of concentration and alertness to avoid the careless untruth that just abounds in culture. And we live in, think of politics these days and the kinds of accusations and jumping to conclusions and attributing rotten motives and all that. The culture is just full of assaults on the truth and slippings and slidings where the truth is concerned, so that a person who actually tries to do it will find that he or she is in a very countercultural condition and may even be thought odd.
I don't think I would characterize most people as not wanting to do any of those. I'm sure you didn't hear that question, right? Because it was... Okay, I think the question is, so you have a Christian community that cares about these practices, but you're reaching out then and you're welcoming people, am I getting it right, who don't practice any of those things, who are not committed to truth-telling, who are not committed to keeping promises, and who are ungrateful and inhospitable. Why are you welcome? No. Most of the time people are not quite that grim, right? But I do think that that's where things like patience and discernment come in. There is a long walking with people toward wholeness so that we are committed to them. There's a certain fidelity as there's genuine indication that somebody wants a relationship. It takes a long time to help people work through some of those, especially if they've been sort of formed by a culture of lying or betrayal. If they have experienced betrayal over and over in their lives, it is very hard to hold on to them long term. And so I think there's a couple things. One is there you practice faithfulness and commitment, and you don't measure success by whether or not that person completely makes it, because the success is going to be whether or not you're faithful. The excellence in that practice is going to be whether or not you can be faithful in that situation. But because these are all bilateral, because these are all depend on the other person, well, at least the promise-keeping and truth-telling do, and hospitality. They depend on another person also to be part of the relationship. There's no guarantees. And so part of it is recognizing that betrayal, your own betrayal may be part of that experience. And those are the hard parts, the really hard parts. Good question.
One more in the front row.
Throughout the presentation, you've kind of touched on the role of leadership or leaders in establishing an example of community. I was wondering if you could speak more to that specifically, how leaders and good leadership skills can establish these core practices and develop a strong community, not necessarily just in a church, but in a variety of contexts.
Yeah. This is a question about leadership and how leaders can, in a sense, embody the practices or teach them or whatever, whether it's in a congregation or, I would assume, a family or a business or whatever. Leaders, if they're trying to help create communities, have to do their best to, in a sense of this partnership of grace and actual some discipline, but really need to practice the practices. They need to be able to embody them, at least to a certain extent, or it's going to be very hard for the congregation to understand what they look like or how they're supposed to be working. So leaders who don't keep promises but demand that their congregation does become problematic really quickly. Leaders where there's deception, and yet you're talking about asking your congregation to be truthful. So there needs to be a certain consistency. I think it can also help to actually name what we're talking about, because most of the time it's not how we think. When we come up against difficulties in community life, we tend to use more therapeutic language. We think in terms of psychology a lot more than we think in terms of practices or something. So helping people shift, there's nothing wrong with psychology, but getting them to shift gears a little bit and think slightly differently in ways that'll connect them a little bit more with the tradition, so that how we're treating each other actually matters kind of theologically, and helping your people think about that can be useful. This lady right here has been trying to...
Second row.
Isn't there a spiritual gift of hospitality? And if so, how does that fit in?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a question that comes up quite often. There may well be a spiritual gift. The question was whether or not there was a spiritual gift of hospitality and how that essentially fits in. The call to hospitality in the scriptures is a call to every Christian. There's no doubt about that. The passages are for the whole church. I think there are some people who are clearly gifted at it, who make it look easier, who just have we know what those people look like. And I think that they need to be celebrated and recognized because they can teach other folks how to do the practice better. But I think the notion that just some people have a gift of hospitality is just really a problem because all of us are called to it.
Some who have the gift of hospitality most of them are raven-haired Presbyterian women in their 40s whose glasses hang on strings.
I need an interpretation of tongues on this one.
How do we deal with the fact that our culture, especially in North America, has commoditized hospitality? Places like Starbucks, my hotel, is very hospitable to me, but I pay them to be. And how do we deal with the fact that people are conditioned that if someone is hospitable, it's because they want something from you or you have paid them in order to be hospitable?
Well, there's no doubt that hospitality has been commercialized. That's a major thing. So people with resources are really not dependent on hospitality in the way that they were in Abraham and Sarah's or Jesus' day. When people traveled centuries ago, they were dependent on the kindness of strangers. They needed someone to take them in because either there were no inns or they were of ill repute and those kind of things. So there's no doubt that it's commercialized. There's no doubt that hospitality can be used for what the ancient tradition called, it could be ambitious or used for advantage, that people will use it instrumentally to get something. And that runs all the way through the culture at this point. I mean, we do all sorts of things. We host business meetings and we give a nice dinner in the hope that the client will be responsive. I think sometimes churches do that. And so I think one of the powerful countercultural messages is when we offer hospitality without strings. People are profoundly affected when there's no apparent gain except that you really wanted that person to be with you, that you valued them enough. That is a shocking statement today when almost all of our relationships are very instrumental.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Paul, the enculturation of social media, what influence does that have on capacity for communities from your perspective? Does it diminish it? Does it enhance it? Is it indifferent in terms of our capacity to generate and develop genuine?
It's a good question. The question about the impact of social media on community and whether it can be positive, generative, or entirely problematic. I don't know. I genuinely don't know. I think there are ways in which social media can reinforce community. It can't really create a deep kind of level of community, but it can reinforce it where it's already there. I think it can also distract from community, where people are always thinking about something else and not being present. So I think it's probably going to be a mixed bag for a while. I'm happy to hear from other folks on that one.
Yes, sir, John.
You addressed this a little bit already, but I think most Christians do feel that tension between, enjoying a material wealth and blessing others don't have what we do in various parts of the world, even in our own cities. Some communities respond much more radically to that, like the new monasticism, for example, which you may be familiar with. You've got very intentional communities that are being hospitable and sharing resources. Most evangelicals aren't quite ready to do that, and I just wondered if you could give more insight into how we navigate the sort of radical call to the gospel, to live in community, to share things, and our own inclinations to be individualistic. I know it's a huge question. Are there some tips?
I'm trying to figure out how, some of you didn't hear probably, right? the question here is coming back around to the question about materialism in this culture and our having substantial resources and how we might respond, and how some more intentional Christian communities, at least in some cases, are responding more holistically, more totally in the sense of sharing of goods and so on. I think there's so much that needs to be done in terms of rethinking what it is we need. I mean, the ancient tradition was sort of everything that you had beyond what you needed belonged to the poor. We are so far away from that. And, you know, John Wesley's teaching, anything beyond necessity and possibly convenience, God has not given to you, but has given to you to pass on to other people. So I think that's a huge challenge. I think that it may be a problem of the too big at this point, but I think we have to at least move in increments in that direction of things like the graduated tithe that Ron Sider has, you know, where you figure out what you need to live on and then give away much more in each sort of increment above that, and so on. I think that one of the crucial things, and probably this is coming out of my experience of hospitality and then thinking about the book that I did about friendship at the margins, is it's absolutely crucial that we have friends, genuine friends, that we cultivate friendships with people who don't have very much, because it changes how we think about our own lives dramatically. It's very easy to sort of develop kind of a cocoon where everybody has at least as much as we have, if not more. And so who's our comparator group? It's going to always be the people with more. If we locate our lives at least 1 foot in the world, if we are very aware of where the real needs are in terms of resources, I think we'll live differently. So I think that would be one of the clues. It's just a small step in a direction that I think we really need to take.
In the way back.
You mentioned that our society values choices rather than making commitments and so forth. And I see that especially working with college students, you know, having to get them to commit fully for small, short missions. Even with social media, they'd rather do a maybe on an event rather than a yes or no. And you had mentioned a couple of things where we could maybe reinforce for them to go towards making those promises. Teaching about baptism, also pastors modeling promise keeping. What other ways can we challenge, especially our young people, to make commitments and also keep promises?
This might be one we want to turn outward here. It's a good question. The question is again about how we can help people become better at making and keeping promises, especially in a culture of choice where people are so resistant to it. I think part of the challenge again is to be truthful in naming what's going on. I'm not sure that people always know what it is that's going on there or how difficult it is. So that it can be a sort of a teachable moment. But I would be interested in hearing from you all about whether or not you have seen efforts to get people to be more consistent in their willingness to make commitments.
Straight center field, short center field.
I actually attend Spring Arbor University in Spring Arbor, Michigan, right outside of Jackson, and I work as student body president for all of the campus, and I oversee 36 student workers, and then also work with resident life, as in resident directors and peer advisors. And I feel like the peer advisor type of mentality, which is a community / mentoring program that our school has created, where one upperclassman walks alongside 10 to 12 freshmen for their entire first semester, going through everything from boyfriend or girlfriend breakups to they have to go to the hospital to I am struggling right now with my spiritual life, to the point where they are on call 24/7, and it's really cool to see, because I have multiple friends who are in this position who have to deal with students who are coming from betrayal of friends and coming from the fact that they don't have trust for anyone, and yet they're trying to establish their faith even further, but yet that one-on-one mentoring, and it's even to the point where not only are they a phone call away or a classroom away or whatever, but they are required on a weekly basis to have a meeting with every student in their group. So they do paperwork that's then filed to the director of the program, and then if there's a problem or something else needs to be established, then hire people like myself or actual full-time staff members within student development, then walk alongside of those students even more, to the point of if they have like a cigarette addiction and it's against our concept, but that was what they were taught their entire high school career or their life, but they want to grow further and get rid of that.
Yeah.
Then they walk alongside of them, and there's no embarrassment, there's no fear of bringing that forward. And I think
Great.
that's a great way to approach it.
Great. I think actually that's very helpful in terms of that picture of sort of an ongoing mentoring of walking alongside people as they, in a sense, learn to keep the practices more faithfully. I think accountability groups of one sort or another where people are, where it's discussed truthfully but kindly, where we kind of face those issues of making commitments could also be helpful.
And also, in preaching and teaching within the church, calling attention to conspicuous examples of people who stuck to their promises.
Yes, yes. I think highlighting the good can be really helpful. Yeah.
Way back.
In listening to this and trying to apply it to my own life, I hear the word sacrifice. And maybe we don't have any idea of what we should do to sacrifice so that we can be hospitable even when we're tired, we don't feel like it, or tell the truth when we don't want people to know about ourselves. Do we really trust that God is going to protect us and see us through the hard times when we make ourselves vulnerable?
Good. I think that's helpful. Yeah. I mean, there is an element of sacrifice and self-denial in the practices. Yeah.
Third row.
Yeah, just addressing a few of the things we've named: hospitality, community, and truth. In the culture we have today, we've become more of a, as you view it, positive, open-minded, negatively relativistic kind of culture where people, the truth itself becomes very shaky. People aren't really as hard-nosed about it as they used to be. Now, in the Christian church, we've got the community, the larger community of all practicing Christians. But then we also have our individual communities, which are culture or denominational based and such. Now, whereas 100 years ago, there might have been a sharp distinction between, say, a Southern Baptist and a Roman Catholic or something like that. Today, it seems like many Christians have become more hospitable and welcoming to people of different segments of the faith and such. Now, how do we strike a really good balance in our individual churches between being that welcoming, very ecumenical, very hospitable kinds of Christians without watering down what are important distinctions often? So how do we strike a balance between being open to all sorts of people, but also not watering down the truth to the point that it becomes meaningless, sort of?
Good. Did everybody hear that? I think the question here basically is in a setting in which a lot of the things that used to separate Christians by their distinctions have sort of faded. And we know that we need to practice hospitality. What, in a sense, what's going to define us as a community? Is that fair enough? What are we going to hold on to that really does distinguish us? I think one of the things I learned in working on hospitality is that in many ways the most hospitable communities know who they are. They aren't, people don't want to be welcomed into hotel rooms. They want to be welcomed into families. And families or churches have a real sense of identity, a sense of tradition, of history, of commitments, and so on. And so, although it seems sometimes in some ways counterintuitive, it's robust communities that can practice hospitality. Now, I think that, again, I would distinguish a little bit the difference between hospitality and membership. People, as they can be welcomed into a community, there's a sense in which we're all welcomed into communities. All of us, we expect God is going to transform. And so part of the question then becomes, what does this community hold as central? And sorting that out is important. And then what are the other things that are cultural, that are nice but not absolutely central, and so on? What can we give on, and those kind of things. It's a hard question.
Way back in the center.
Yeah, you touched on kind of the neo-monastic residential Christian type of movement a couple times today. I wonder, so I think one of the basic assumptions of that type of ministry or community is that if we live together, our capacity to be the people of God is somehow increased. Do you find in your research that that's true? If not, why not? If so, should we head to the woods?
Head to the woods as in becoming new monastics, except that mostly they live in inner cities or something? Yeah, right. I think there are ways. I mean, part of the reason that I'm always drawn toward intentional communities when I'm doing the research is because the issues come up quicker and more intensely when people are in close proximity and are intersecting each other's lives on a daily kind of basis. Church life, conventional congregational life, is a lot more spread out. You can kind of walk away from a lot of the things, but you also miss a lot of the wonder and goodness of close community. I think there are ways in which very close community actually makes our lives more complicated and difficult, and may sometimes actually require an awful lot of attention that sometimes in broader community settings don't require. I think on the other hand, the power of a group of people united together in a particular place, understanding themselves as called to a particular task is an incredible thing. So I think it's almost a both and. It is more difficult, and it can also be incredibly life-giving.
Way back.
It strikes me as just a comment here. This conversation can make it a lot harder to read 1 Corinthians 13. If I have sort of a middle-of-the-road view of being a pretty good person, 1 Corinthians 13 is pretty easy to read through. If I think in terms of offering hospitality to people I don't really want to be with, or feeling entitled rather than grateful, or wanting to spin the truth so I look better, and not wanting to serve others, then 1 Corinthians 13 is a whole lot harder to read. Thanks.
Thanks for the word of encouragement. Yes.
Well, we're coming to the end of this session, and I'm sure once again I speak for all of us by saying that you have brought us an immense gift today, and we are very grateful. Thank you.